When Ethan and I stepped into the lawyer's office, the air felt ice cold despite the heat outside. A long, narrow room, shelves lined with folders, and a man behind a massive oak desk, holding our fates in his hands. A part of me still believed in fairness, not in miracles, no, but at least in simple, human equality. We were both our parents' children, and when they were gone, I didn't expect wealth, just honesty. The lawyer spoke in a measured, emotionless tone, as if reading an instruction manual. The house, investments, the family business, everything was listed in dry legal terms, and all of it went to Ethan. I waited for my turn, expecting something. Savings, a small inheritance, even just a share of our parents' estate. Instead, debts. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. There must be some mistake. The lawyer looked at me with pity, but nothing more. No, miss. Your parents allocated everything exactly this way. I turned to Ethan. His face remained unreadable, but there was a smirk hiding in the corners of his lips. It's nothing personal, he said with a shrug. Just business. Business. The word sounded like a verdict. I walked out of the office, feeling everything inside me collapse. The world I had known, the one where things were supposed to be at least somewhat fair, had turned to smoke. I was left with nothing. Ethan, with everything. But if he thought it would be that easy, he was wrong. I walked away with my head down, but inside I was burning. How could he do this? Ethan and I had grown up in the same house, eaten at the same table, shared both joys and failures. And now, I was nothing. Not just disinherited, burdened with debt. My parents hadn't left me support. They had left me in chains. The first few months after that day were hell. Debt collectors called daily, demanding payments. I lived in a tiny rented apartment, counting every penny. I worked 12-hour shifts, taking on any side job I could find, just to claw my way out of the pit they had thrown me into. Meanwhile, Ethan, he was celebrating. Parties were held at our parents' house every week. Alcohol flowed freely. Luxury cars filled the driveway. Social media was flooded with pictures. Ethan surrounded by women, on yachts, behind the wheel of new cars. The money that could have been my safety net, he was burning like paper. Every time I walked past our old home, I saw the lights on, heard the music seeping through the closed windows. He wasn't just enjoying himself, he was making sure I knew. But fate has little patience for the arrogant, especially ones like him. The cracks in Ethan's empire started small, so small that he probably didn't even notice. A few bad investments, a failed business deal, an extravagant party that cost more than it should have. But greed is insatiable, and when you believe you're untouchable, you stop being careful. At first, I only heard whispers. A former business partner muttering about unpaid invoices. A post on social media hinting at financial troubles, but then the whispers turned into headlines. Local entrepreneur faces legal troubles over unpaid debts. The words sent a jolt through me. Ethan? In debt? It was almost poetic. I watched from a distance as his world slowly unraveled. The luxury cars disappeared first, replaced by a single, more modest vehicle. Then the house, our parents' house, was listed for sale. It was strange, standing across the street and watching the for sale sign go up. That house was supposed to be ours. Instead, it had been turned into a monument to Ethan's arrogance, and now it was slipping through his fingers. But the worst was yet to come. Lawsuits followed. Investors he had cheated, banks he had lied to. One by one, they came for him. I imagined him sitting in his high-rise office, staring at the mounting bills, his world crashing down around him. And then, one evening, as I locked up my small bookstore, the one I had built from nothing, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Sarah." I turned, and there he was. But not the Ethan I had known. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by cheap, wrinkled clothes. His eyes, once filled with smug confidence, now held something else. Desperation. "I need help," he admitted, swallowing his pride. "Just a place to stay. A fresh start." I let the silence stretch between us, savoring the moment. Then I met his gaze and smiled. "Ethan, it's not personal," I said softly. "It's just business." And with that, I walked away. I didn't see Ethan for a while after that night. Maybe he finally got the message. Maybe he found another way to dig himself out of the mess he created. Either way, I moved on. I focused on my bookstore, on paying off the debts my parents had left me, on building something of my own, something that couldn't be taken away. But life has a cruel sense of irony. It started with a phone call. "Miss Carter." The voice on the other end was formal, cautious. "This is St. Vincent's Hospital. Your brother, Ethan Carter, was admitted last night. We found your number listed as his emergency contact." For a second, I couldn't breathe. Ethan had listed me as his emergency contact? I wanted to tell them it wasn't my problem, that whatever had happened to him was his own doing. But instead, I found myself in a cab, heading toward the hospital, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, I barely recognized him. He lay in a hospital bed, an IV in his arm, bruises scattered across his face. He looked smaller somehow, like life had chewed him up and spit him out. The nurse explained that he had collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. Apparently he had been sleeping in his car, barely eating, working odd jobs just to stay afloat. He had nothing left, and for the first time I wondered if I had been wrong. Not about what he did. No, that betrayal would never fade. But about turning my back on him completely. I had spent years wishing for karma to catch up to Ethan, and now that it had, I realized I wasn't sure how to feel about it. I sat beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall. He had destroyed my life once. But was I really going to let him destroy himself? Ethan didn't wake up for hours. I sat there, staring at him, memories flickering through my mind like an old film reel. I remembered the brother who used to chase me through the backyard when we were kids, who once stood up for me in school when some jerk made fun of my glasses. That boy had disappeared long before our parents died, buried under layers of greed and entitlement. And yet, looking at him now, frail and broken, I couldn't help but wonder, was there anything left of him? When he finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open, it took him a moment to focus on me. Confusion flickered across his face, then something else. "You came," he croaked, his voice dry. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for the plastic cup of water on the table beside his bed and handed it to him. He took it, his hands shaking slightly as he drank. "I'm your emergency contact," I said finally. Didn't leave me much choice. A weak smile tugged at his lips, but it faded just as quickly. "Guess I don't have anyone else?" there it was. The truth he had been avoiding. The golden boy. The one who had everything. Had burned every bridge. Squandered every opportunity. And now, at his lowest, the only person left was the one he had betrayed the most. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, all I felt was tired. "What happened, Ethan?" I asked, not because I needed to hear his excuses, but because I needed to understand. He let out a slow breath, staring at the ceiling like he was trying to piece it together himself. Bad investments, lawsuits, debts. It all spiraled. I thought I could fix it, but... He let out a bitter laugh. "Turns out I'm not as smart as I thought I was." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that he didn't already know. "I was a terrible brother, wasn't I?" he murmured after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. I could have lied. I could have softened the truth. But what was the point? "Yeah," I said. "You were." Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Good, I thought, because I wasn't sure I could. But I also wasn't sure I could walk away this time. Ethan was discharged 2 days later. The doctors wanted to keep him longer, but without insurance or money, there wasn't much they could do. I could have left him there, let him figure things out on his own, but something about watching him struggle to sit up, wincing as he moved, made it impossible. So against every instinct I had, I brought him home. My apartment wasn't much, just a tiny 1-bedroom above the bookstore, but it was mine. And now, for the first time in years, Ethan was stepping into something I had built instead of taken. He moved slowly, exhaustion dragging at his every step. When he saw the small couch in the living room, he let out a sigh and sank onto it like a man who had carried too much for too long. "You don't have to do this," he muttered, not looking at me. I know. I wanted to leave it at that, to remind him that this wasn't forgiveness, just temporary shelter. But the words didn't come. Instead, I watched as he rubbed his hands together, his fingers trembling slightly, as if the weight of everything was finally hitting him. "You were right," he said after a moment, his voice low. "About all of it. I was selfish. I was blind. I thought I deserved everything, and I didn't care what it cost you." It wasn't an apology. Not exactly, but it was the closest he had ever come to one. I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. "And now," he exhaled, shaking his head. "Now I don't even know who I am without all of it." That was the thing about people like Ethan. When the money was gone, when the power vanished, they had to face the one thing they had always been running from: themselves. "Guess you'll have to figure that out," I said. He nodded, but there was something haunted in his expression. And for the first time since this all started, I wondered if he had the chance to take it all back. Would he? Or was this just another game, another way to survive? I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him destroy me again. Ethan stayed. At first, it was just supposed to be for a few nights, just long enough for him to get back on his feet, find a job, figure something out. But days turned into weeks, and he was still there, still sleeping on my couch, still moving through life like a ghost of the man he used to be. I should have kicked him out. I should have drawn the line. But every time I looked at him, at the way his clothes hung off his frame, at the exhaustion in his eyes, I hesitated. Because as much as I hated what he had done, he wasn't the same person anymore. He wasn't the golden boy, the untouchable heir. He was just a man who had lost everything. I wasn't stupid, though. I didn't trust him. Not completely. "Where are you going?" he asked one evening as I grabbed my coat. "Work," I said. "Some of us don't have the luxury of sitting around all day." He flinched, but didn't argue. It was a small jab, but it felt necessary. Because no matter how broken he seemed, I couldn't forget the way he had looked at me that day outside the lawyer's office. Smirking. Cold. Dismissing me like I was nothing. And yet, when I got home later that night, something was different. The apartment smelled clean. The dishes that had been piling up in the sink were gone. The clutter on the table, receipts, unopened mail, a half-empty coffee cup, had disappeared. Ethan was sitting on the couch, flipping through one of my old books. "You cleaned?" I said, caught off guard. He shrugged. "Figured I should do something." I didn't know what to make of it. Was this guilt? Some attempt at redemption? Or was it just another performance? Another way to convince me to keep him around? "Don't think this changes anything," I said, because I needed to say it. "I know." But the way he looked at me then, quiet, almost resigned, made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, he finally understood the weight of what he had done. I wasn't ready to forgive him. Maybe I never would be. But for the first time in years, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to see him fall. "Go ahead. But you can do it in chat." ChatGPT Skazal. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan hadn't left the apartment except for short walks around the block. He had no money, no job, no real prospects. At first he seemed content to wallow in his own failure, but eventually something shifted. He started cleaning more, cooking too. Small, simple meals that lacked the extravagance he used to flaunt but were good. I caught him looking through job listings on my laptop one evening, though he closed the tab the second he noticed me watching. Pride. That was the one thing he still had left, even after everything else had been stripped away. "Any luck?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "No one wants to hire a guy with my history." I wasn't surprised. His name had been dragged through the mud after the lawsuits. Every investor he had conned, every business partner he had burned, word had spread. Ethan had spent years believing his reputation made him untouchable. Now, it made him unemployable. "What about something outside your field?" I suggested. He scoffed. "What, like working retail? A barista? You think anyone's going to take me seriously?" "Maybe they won't," I said. "But what other option do you have?" For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then finally, he closed the laptop and stood. "I'll figure it out," he muttered, before walking past me. I watched him go, a strange mix of emotions twisting inside me. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To see him struggle, to watch him squirm under the weight of his own mistakes. Then why did it feel so hollow? Later that night, as I was locking up the bookstore, I got a text from an unknown number. "Still playing the saint, huh? Be careful, Sarah. People like him don't change." A chill crept up my spine. I glanced around, but the street was empty. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me this wasn't just some random warning, and for the first time since I let Ethan in, I wondered, had I made a mistake? I didn't sleep that night. The message lingered in my mind, a whisper of doubt that refused to fade. I kept telling myself it was nothing, probably one of Ethan's old business partners taking a petty shot at him. But the longer I lay there in the dark, the more uneasy I felt. The next morning, I left early for the bookstore, half expecting Ethan to still be sprawled out on the couch. Instead, I found him at the tiny kitchen table, staring at his phone with a look I couldn't quite place. "Something wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then finally he turned the screen toward me. It was an email, a job rejection. I sighed, not sure what he expected me to say. "You'll get another—" "It's not just one," he cut in. "It's all of them. Every application I've sent out, every lead I've chased. They're all shutting me out." I frowned. "It's not exactly a mystery, Ethan. Your name is still tied to everything that happened." He shook his head. "No, this feels deliberate. Like someone's making sure I can't get back on my feet." The message from the night before flashed through my mind. "Still playing the saint, huh? Be careful, Sarah. People like him don't change." I hesitated. Should I tell him? Was I being paranoid? Before I could decide, he stood, jaw tight. "I need some air." He was gone before I could stop him. By the time I got to the bookstore, my nerves were frayed. The morning rush helped, people coming in for their usual coffee and browsing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, just before noon, the door opened and a man walked in. I didn't recognize him, but something about him put me on edge. He was in his late 40s, sharply dressed in a suit that screamed money, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "Can I help you?" I asked. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I was hoping to have a word with you. About Ethan." Every instinct I had told me this wasn't good. I folded my arms. "I don't know what you think I can tell you." He chuckled. "Oh, I think you know plenty. You see, Sarah, I know all about you. About what your brother did to you. About how he left you with nothing." My throat went dry. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "And I know you're letting him stay with you. That's a mistake." I forced myself to stay still, to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" His smile widened. "To offer you a way out. A way to make sure Ethan never drags you down again." My pulse pounded. "And what exactly does that mean?" He slipped a business card onto the counter. "Let's just say some people have a vested interest in making sure Ethan doesn't get back on his feet. You help us, and we'll make sure you come out ahead. No strings attached." Lies. There were always strings. I stared at the card, then back at him. "And if I say no?" His expression didn't change. "Then I hope, for your sake, you're ready for what happens next." And just like that, he turned and walked out, leaving nothing but the weight of his words hanging in the air. I looked down at the card, my stomach twisting. I had spent years thinking Ethan had ruined my life. But now, for the first time, I realized someone else wanted to do it all over again. The card sat in front of me, the weight of it growing heavier with each passing second. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the smooth, cold edge of the glossy paper. The name on it was simple, D. Vance, and underneath, just a number and an email address. No company name, no explanation of who he was, or what he really wanted from me. I tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to me like a shadow. I didn't know what game this man was playing, but I had a feeling it wasn't something I wanted to be part of. I didn't tell Ethan. Not right away. The next few days passed in a blur, me trying to ignore the gnawing thought in the back of my mind. I still hadn't thrown away the card, though I thought about it more than once. But how could I? Every time I looked at it, I could hear the man's voice again, promising that there was more at stake than I knew. And Ethan, despite everything, seemed oblivious to the dangers around him. He was still trying to find work, still looking for any opportunity that might offer him a way out of this downward spiral. He didn't seem to realize that the world he had built on arrogance and greed had already crumbled, and it wasn't just going to pick itself back up. But then, a week later, I came home to find him gone. I didn't panic at first. Maybe he'd gone for a walk or to grab something from the store. He'd been restless lately, almost desperate to fix things he couldn't fix. But when the hours passed and he didn't return, a cold pit formed in my stomach. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. I called his cell, straight to voicemail. I tried not to worry, tried to focus on something else, but it was hard. Too many thoughts ran through my head, each one more terrifying than the last. Had he gone back to his old ways? Had someone come for him? Or worse, was this just his final attempt to cut ties with me for good? Then, at around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. "I need you to meet me. It's important. Don't ask questions. Just come." No context, no explanation, just that. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of fear and frustration. I was about to ignore it, about to turn over and let the anxiety pass, but something in me, some part of me that knew Ethan wasn't entirely beyond saving, told me to go. I grabbed my coat, feeling the cold air rush in as I opened the door. The streets were quiet, dark, almost eerie. I started walking, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I'd find. But I had to see it for myself. I met Ethan in a small park, the kind of place we used to pass by when we were kids. The benches were weathered, and the street lamps cast long shadows over the worn-out path. Ethan was standing near one of the trees, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his posture rigid. "Ethan," I called, my voice breaking the silence. He turned slowly, the faintest trace of guilt in his eyes. "I didn't want you to get involved," he said quietly. "But I don't have a choice." "What's going on?" I demanded. He hesitated. "I made a deal with Vance." My stomach dropped. "What deal?" "I thought it was the only way out. I thought it would help me get back on my feet." His words were tumbling out, rushed and desperate. But I didn't know what I was really signing up for. These people, they don't care about anyone but themselves, and now they want more from me than I can give. More? What are you talking about? He met my gaze, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Fear. Real, gut-wrenching fear. "They know about you, about us. They know you're the one I'm staying with." He paused, looking around as if someone might be listening. "Vance wants me to do something. Something I can't." I took a step closer, my heart racing. "What do you mean? What do they want from you?" He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet. But if I don't do it, if I don't cooperate, they'll come for you. They'll make sure you pay." My pulse thundered in my ears. "Pay? For what?" "For everything," Ethan said, looking down. "For the way I've dragged you through all of this. For everything I've done to you." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he couldn't drag me back into his mess. But I couldn't, because part of me knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me, too. I had a choice to make, a choice I hadn't been ready for. Could I walk away and leave him to face this on his own? Or would I stand by him, even knowing that this was the moment when everything changed? Ethan was asking for my help, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure he deserved it. By the time I saw the final piece of the puzzle fall into place, everything had changed. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about restoring some balance of fairness or getting back at Ethan. I had learned that there was something more important than all of that: self-respect. In the beginning, I had been filled with fury, driven by the desire to see Ethan and those who sought to ruin him fall. But as the game played out, I realized that I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing this for me, for my own peace, my own justice. The anger had started to fade, replaced by something more powerful: clarity. I had spent years holding on to the weight of betrayal, only to find that the true power came when I let go. In the end, I wasn't going to make the same mistakes. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. Ethan was there, watching it all happen. I could see the realization in his eyes, the same fear I had seen in him months before. Only now, it was clearer. He understood what he had lost, what I had gained. But the people who had pushed us both to this point, they were going to pay. Vance. His smug, calculating smile haunted me for weeks, but I knew he had made one critical error. He had underestimated me, thinking I was just a pawn in their little game. What he didn't know was that I had learned to play this game better than they ever could. The final blow came not from me directly, but from the trap I had set, a move that Vance never saw coming. I had gathered every shred of evidence, every document, every piece of information. Ethan's financial failures weren't just mistakes. They were lies. They were deliberate, crafted to manipulate everyone in his life, especially me. I handed everything over to the press, a carefully crafted leak to a journalist who knew exactly how to turn the public's attention onto Vance's financial empire. It was brutal, swift, and unforgiving. The revelations of Vance's shady dealings, his role in Ethan's downfall, and his manipulation of me came crashing down on him in one fell swoop. Ethan, who had once stood beside Vance, now found himself betrayed by his own mentor. The media tore Vance apart, piece by piece, until he was nothing more than a shell of the man he used to be. What had started as a business deal quickly spiraled into an exposure of criminal activities. Vance was arrested, his company dissolved, and every deal he had made was put under scrutiny. Investors pulled out. His friends abandoned him. But it didn't end there for Ethan. The mistake he made, the one fatal error, was that he hadn't understood how deep the betrayal had run. By trusting Vance, by thinking that his quick-fix solutions could fix everything, he had buried himself in a mountain of debt, lies, and shame. Vance had used him just as he had tried to use me. But unlike Ethan, I had seen through it. I knew that Vance's downfall wasn't my fault, but Ethan had been too blind to see it. When the dust settled, Ethan had lost everything: his business, his reputation, his friends. Everything he thought he could rely on had crumbled, just like the house of cards he had built. And now standing in the rubble of his empire, he knew he couldn't come back from it. As for me, I had rebuilt everything from the ground up. The bookstore had become more than just a place of work. It was a symbol of my strength. My new life wasn't about wealth or luxury. It was about peace. About knowing that I could stand tall on my own 2 feet, with no one holding me back. The weight I had carried for so long had finally lifted. And though I wasn't going to forgive Ethan, At least not any time soon. I could finally live without that gnawing bitterness in my chest. I stayed in the city, at least for now. There was a sense of calm in the chaos of New York, a quiet place where I could breathe and start anew. And sometimes, when I passed Ethan in the street, looking like a shadow of the man he had once been, I couldn't help but feel the smallest bit of satisfaction. But it wasn't about his misery. It was about the simple truth that I no longer needed his approval, or anyone else's, to move forward. The people who had once looked down on me now saw me differently. The whispers about my family, my struggles, had faded. They knew the truth now, how I had fought my way out, how I had survived, and I didn't need anything else. One evening, as I was closing the bookstore, I received a text. "Sarah, it's Ethan. I need your help. Please, just talk to me." I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I typed back, "Ethan, you've already had your chance." And then I pressed send. I never heard from him again. As I locked the door behind me, I smiled. It was quiet. The city was just starting to come alive with the evening's pulse, and for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing but peace. I had won.